Will drove through a quiet road in the Hollywood Hills with his girlfriend Kira. They were heading to a dinner party hosted by his ex-wife Eden and her new husband David. Kira noticed his unease and suggested they could turn back, but Will said he was fine. While driving, they hit a coyote. Will stepped out of the car, saw that the animal was dying, and killed it with a tire iron to end its suffering. They soon arrived at a large, modern house that once belonged to Will and Eden. He told Kira that it was never really his, only Eden's. Inside, several guests were already gathered: Tommy and Miguel, Ben, Claire, and Gina. They all greeted Will and Kira warmly. Gina mentioned that her boyfriend Choi was running late and that her phone had no signal. Eden and David entered to greet everyone. Eden hugged Will tightly and said she had missed him. David poured wine for everyone and began talking about how happy they were to have their friends together again. As Will looked around, he saw a half-naked woman in the hallway. Moments later, she came out and introduced herself as Sadie, saying she lived there with Eden and David after meeting them in Mexico. As the group settled, Will wandered into the kitchen and looked around. He remembered a time when Eden had attempted suicide there. Eden appeared behind him and commented on his appearance. Will asked her about the metal bars now fixed to the windows. She said they were for safety because she had lived alone for a time. When Will asked how she was, Eden said she was happy and free from pain. Ben entered and joked about her spiritual talk, saying it sounded crazy. Without warning, Eden slapped him across the face. The room went silent. She quickly walked out. Ben laughed awkwardly, saying he didn't mean to offend her. Will told him that both Eden and David were acting strangely. Ben agreed, saying she might have lost touch after everything that happened. A few minutes later, Eden returned, apologized to Ben, and handed him a drink. The others tried to move on. Claire spoke with Will privately and said the atmosphere felt off. Before Will could respond, a knock came at the door. David opened it to find a man none of them knew. He introduced him as Pruitt, friend from Mexico. Gina again worried about Choi not showing up. When she asked to use the landline, Eden said it was disconnected. David locked the front door and pocketed the key, explaining there had been a recent break-in nearby. Will questioned the decision, asking what they would do in case of a fire. David hesitated, then returned the key to the lock and told everyone to relax. Later, Will stepped outside for firewood. As he crossed the yard, he had flashes of his past life there with Eden and their son. When he looked toward the house, he saw Eden in her room, hiding something in a drawer. Curious, he sneaked inside and found a bottle of pills without a label. He pocketed one before David came in and asked him to rejoin the party. As the guests sat in the living room, David announced that he and Eden had joined a spiritual organization called The Invitation. Sadie and Pruitt were also part of it. The group listened uneasily as David explained that it was about overcoming grief. To demonstrate, he played a video from the group's leader. On the screen, the leader, Dr. Joseph, spoke gently to a dying woman, asking her who she hoped to see after death. She answered that she wanted to see her father and husband. The leader told her not to be afraid and that her pain would soon end. The woman lay back, exhaled, and died. Everyone in the room was stunned. Eden and David insisted it was peaceful and meant to show that death should not be feared. David talked about how he had once used drugs to cope with his own loss and how the invitation had freed him. He mentioned Eden's past grief, which made Will visibly uncomfortable. Just then, the doorbell rang. David and Pruitt went to answer it and briefly spoke to someone outside. Will watched from a distance but couldn't hear. David returned, saying it was just neighbors looking for another party. Will sat alone in the kitchen. Miguel approached him and Will showed him the pill from Eden's drawer. Miguel examined it and said it was a barbiturate, harmless in small doses but dangerous in quantity. After a pause, David apologized to everyone for the heavy tone and suggested a game called I Want, where each person shared something they desired. Sadie went first, saying she wanted to show everyone how much she loved them. She suddenly kissed Gina on the lips. The group laughed uneasily. Pruitt then spoke about his past, confessing that he had killed his wife during an argument while drunk and spent 7 years in prison. He said the invitation helped him find peace and he no longer felt guilt. The guests were disturbed. Claire said she wanted to leave. David tried to persuade her to stay, but Will defended her choice. As she prepared to go, Pruitt said his car was blocking hers and went outside with her to move it. Will watched from the window as Pruitt shifted his car, then saw him talk to Claire briefly. David came over and confronted Will about being suspicious of him. Will said he was just uneasy, and David told him to let go of the past. Dinner began soon after. As they ate, Will drifted into memories of his son's birthday, the day of the accident that killed him. Overwhelmed, he left the table and walked outside. From a distance, he saw Sadie standing by a mirror making strange faces. When she noticed him watching, she smiled and approached. Outside by the pool, Sadie flirted with him and suggested they sleep together. She said they shouldn't deny pleasure and that in Mexico, everyone was intimate with each other. Will refused and told her to go back inside. Alone, he tried to get a phone signal and finally received a voicemail from Choi. The message revealed that Choi had been at the door earlier in the evening, but left briefly to pick something up. Shocked, Will realized that David and Eden had lied about not seeing him. He went back inside, tense and silent. As everyone gathered around the table again, the lights dimmed and Eden entered with a birthday cake for Miguel. Will suddenly confronted her and David, demanding to know where Choi was and accusing them of hiding something. Kira tried to calm him, but he kept pressing. Then the doorbell rang. To everyone's surprise, it was Choi, alive and unharmed. He explained that he had indeed stopped by earlier, but had to leave for work. Will froze, humiliated, and apologized. Eden and David told him it was all right. The tension eased slightly. Later, Will sat outside alone, and Kira joined him. He said he still couldn't let go of the past and blamed himself for their son's death. She comforted him, telling him that moving forward wasn't betrayal. Will returned inside and walked to his son's old room, standing silently among the toys and photos. Through the window, he saw David outside, lighting a red lantern. He went downstairs, where a laptop was still open, playing another message from the cult leader. The leader urged his followers to surrender themselves and promised a reward beyond life. When Will rejoined the group, David poured wine for everyone, preparing for a toast. As the glasses were raised, Will suddenly shouted for them not to drink. The others hesitated, startled. Sadie screamed that he was ruining everything and lunged at him. Will shoved her away, and she fell, striking her head on a table corner. Everyone rushed to check on her, but then they noticed Gina slumped over, foam forming in her mouth. Miguel reached for her, and before anyone could react, David pulled out a gun and shot him. The guests panicked and scattered. Pruitt grabbed the gun and shot Choi as he tried to run. Screaming filled the house. Tommy attacked David, and Kira fought back with a knife. Will and Kira fled down a hallway as Pruitt fired behind. They locked themselves in a room, but found that every door and window was sealed with bars. Through a gap, Will saw David and Pruitt dragging Ben's body toward the backyard. They shot him and left him there. Kira began to panic, but Will whispered that they had to stay quiet and find a way out. They crept through the hallway, passing Sadie's body. She was still alive, but had impaled herself with a fireplace poker. Will took the weapon and moved on. Moments later, Pruitt appeared, aiming his gun. Will struck at him, and the two fought violently. Pruitt overpowered him and was about to fire, but Kira smashed a wine bottle over his head and beat him repeatedly until he stopped moving. Will and Kira stood over Pruitt's body, breathing heavily. They could hear footsteps and faint movement elsewhere in the house. Moving quietly, they picked up the gun that had fallen from Pruitt's hand. They descended the stairs carefully. The living room was in disarray, with shattered glasses and overturned chairs. From another room, they heard David calling Eden's name. Eden appeared suddenly at the end of the hallway, holding a gun. She pointed it at them with trembling hands. Before Will could react, she fired, hitting him in the shoulder. He fell against the wall. Eden looked horrified by what she had done. She stepped closer, whispered an apology, and turned the gun on herself. The shot echoed through the house as she collapsed, clutching her stomach. David rushed in from another doorway, shouting her name. When he saw her bleeding on the floor, he ran to her side. Will, still holding his wound, told him to stop and warned that they had a gun. David didn't care. He said it was all right, that Eden would soon be free and with the others. Will aimed the gun at him and told him not to move. David said softly that they would all understand once it was over. He raised his weapon, and before he could fire, Tommy appeared from behind and tackled. The two men struggled violently, overturning furniture. Kira helped Will stand as Tommy and David fought on the floor. David slashed Tommy's arm with a knife, but Tommy managed to grab the blade, turned it, and stabbed David in the stomach. David fell back, gasping and bleeding heavily. The house fell silent except for the sound of shallow breathing. Eden lay against the wall, her hands pressed over her wound. She looked at Will and said she missed their son. Her voice weakened, and she asked him to take her outside. Will nodded. Despite his pain, he and Kira lifted her gently, with Tommy's help, and carried her out into the cool night air. They set her down on the grass near the pool. Eden looked up at the sky, took a final breath, and died. The three survivors sat beside her body, exhausted and shaken. From inside the house came no sound. The fire crackled faintly from the fireplace through the open door. Far away, the sound of police sirens began to grow louder. Will looked toward the hills and saw flashing lights approaching through the trees. Then, from a nearby house, came a scream. Another shot followed. The noise carried across the neighborhood. Will lifted his head and noticed something glowing red in the distance. A lantern, just like the one David had lit earlier, burned on a patio across the street. Then he saw another, and another. All along the hillside, red lights shimmered shimmered outside dozens of homes. He realized they weren't alone. Other houses had followed the same plan. Kira gripped his hand tightly. Tommy stared in silence. They stood together in the yard, surrounded by the faint glow of the lanterns, the distant sirens, and the echo of screams moving through the night. Will's eyes remained fixed on the red light burning in the darkness.